Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Monday, the 15th, where we are finishing up the semester before our final examination, which will be this Wednesday. And we are finishing the semester the way we began it, with Stephen King. We began talking about Stephen King's Danse Macabre, where he was talking a little bit about his impressions of the Gothic genre and horror film. And now we end with a couple of his works. And Stephen King is probably best known for his novels. I knew we wouldn't have time for that in this semester. So instead, we are reading a couple of his short stories from one of his older anthologies, and that's entitled Night Shift. You can see in the notes below, I was able to find a link for the anthology as well as find specific links for the two short stories that we are talking about. Jerusalem's Lot and One for the Road. I thought it would also be um, helpful to talk a little bit about the foreword, which is in many respects similar to what we talked about in Danse Macabre. He talked a little bit about how horror writers are oftentimes maligned because, and one of the reasons why is that they bring bad news, as he says, death. And as we've seen over the course of the semester, all of the texts really have talked about death in one way or another. And that the text really serves as a filter between the conscious and the unconscious, the allegorical, if you will. So, all of the texts we've talked about this semester, we've talked about how they can represent rather than just be literal. And you probably, when you were reading Jerusalem's Lot, felt a lot of nostalgia, perhaps, because it very much is a homage to Dracula. And it also is the basis for one of Stephen King's most famous novels, Salem's Lot, which I highly encourage you to read. It's a great piece. And we see a short story that's written in the epistolary format of journals and letters set in the 1800s, and we know that that's pretty much the origin of the Gothic tradition. We hear about an isolated home that has a dark history. And again, we've seen that over the course of the semester. There's references to rats in the walls. And in fact, there is a story by H.P. Lovecraft about rats in the walls. There's lots of historical lore associated with it. We know that the past always comes to invade the present in the Gothic. There's a reference to Anne Radcliffe, one of the early Gothic writers. There are church desecrations, and we've just put some closure onto The Exorcist. There's references to Nosferatu, so this is the very origins of vampire in terms of film. There's references to incest and inbreeding. Again, you should think about H.P. Lovecraft. Whippoorwills, which again Lovecraft had mentioned in his short stories, and Yoggoth. So again, what he's doing, and I think Stephen King is brilliant with it, is that he's modernizing these texts. He is basically taking these Gothic traditions, but putting them in language that's much more accessible for our audience and putting them in contemporary time periods. So in this particular instance, we see how most of the short story is set in the past. And we find out about a hereditary evil that ultimately will continue on into the present. Not that I want to give too many spoilers if you haven't gotten to it yet. One for the Road, also another vampire tale. And again, it should bring forth ideas of Salem's Lot. This is a modernized vampire tale. Stephen King likes to oftentimes talk about Maine. He's from Maine, and he oftentimes will talk about snowstorms as a kind of monstrosity, specifically the nor'easter. So if you've ever experienced a nor'easter, then you know exactly how that can be monstrous. Set in a bar where there's reference to Jerusalem's Lot, and of course, Jerusalem's Lot is the short story that I had assigned ahead of time, so you can see how these two sort of fit together. In fact, many of Stephen King's stories basically form a much bigger universe. And, well, let's just say that you don't want to go into the lot. And sometimes people who aren't too bright, Easterners, for instance, from Boston, might end up going somewhere where they may not necessarily be wanted. And I'll leave it at that. There is no attendance question today because basically I know we're at the ending of the semester. Our next class is Wednesday, and that would be the last date in which you could hand in any outstanding assignments. And also, it is the date in which I am going to be posting the final examination. So I will post the final exam on Wednesday at the time in which our class would normally meet, which would be 8 a.m. And you have 24 hours in which to respond to that final exam. And that would be Thursday, 8 a.m. on the 18th. And I don't expect anything as neat or as polished or as developed as what you would do with a paper. But basically, you should be able to synthesize some of the main points we've talked about over the course of the semester. It's an essay exam, and I'll give you some choice there. And it's open book, open notes, so you can reference materials from our class. And usually I get a question about length. If this were a face-to-face situation, you'd have approximately 2 hours to take the exam. So I'm anticipating that you would spend approximately 2 hours on this exam, even though you have 24 hours. And that said, I don't expect anything as neat or as polished or as well developed as what you would do with the paper. It's just a way for you to synthesize things. So the best way really to prepare for the final exam is what you've been doing all semester long, hopefully, that you've been watching these videos, that you've been answering the discussion forum responses, and that you have at the very least been reading your peers' responses and my responses in turn, though you're certainly welcome to respond to your peers as well. So, in terms of where we are, I just have a final farewell message for you to click on. This is in the 5th section of the notes below from a friend of mine. And we will continue on next class with our final exam. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on and end the semester. Take care. Bye-bye.